Chapter 9 and 10 of the second book of Hard Times are brilliant if you're looking at the role of women and gender within the novel. So here in the last of it describes Mrs. Gradgrind's death. So this absent woman, basically, who becomes totally absent in her death and yet also slightly rebels against the system. And then Mrs. Sparsit's staircase is where Mrs. Sparsit is watching Louisa and James Harthouse getting ever closer. Very much actually like Bryony in Atonement, watching Cecilia and Robbie starting to get close. Both of them observe it through a window and don't quite make out the whole story, so it's a great little bit to compare. So here in the last of it is a great bit basically in terms of in terms of, you know, the role of women. So what we get on page 184, halfway down, is Louisa's going home. We get this big sort of chunk of text describing Louisa's journey home. It starts, neither as she approached her older home now did any of the best influences of old home descend upon her. The dreams of childhood, its airy fables, its graceful, beautiful, humane, impossible adornments of the world beyond, so good to be believed in once, so good to be remembered when outgrown. For the least among them rises to the stature of a great charity in the heart, suffering little children to come into the midst of it, and to keep with their pure hands a garden in the stony ways of the world. This sentence goes on and on and on and on, a massive, massive list, and ends with, what had she to do with these? So Dickens plays around with this idea, you know, his narrator sort of gives us this big, big list with the list of adjectives, graceful, beautiful, humane, impossible, this big description of what childhood should be, and then ends with that question, what had she to do with that? Now, we've had a big focus from the narrator through it on what's not there, you know, what's been left behind in the utilitarian system. And here it's sort of flipped on its head, a massive list, loads of words, loads of information about what childhood should be, followed by that tiny little question, well, what's she got to do with it? So this time it's dwelling on all those things that she'd missed and then reminding us that actually it was never there. Top of 185, well, bottom of 184 actually, her remembrances of home and childhood were remembrances of the drying up of every spring and fountain in a young heart as it gushed out. So a nice little metaphor of a heart drying up like a fountain. Great link to Atonement, where you've also got a fountain. Bryony observes Cecilia and Robbie at the fountain, which itself is a very small fountain that isn't working, to represent the decline of the upper classes. The golden waters were not there, they were flowing for the fertilisation of the land, where grapes are gathered from thorns and figs from thistles. So Dickens basically reminding us that, you know, Louisa's emotion has just never got going, really. We get Mrs. Gradgrind about 3/4 of the way down, speak to Louisa. Well, my dear, so Mrs. Gradgrind, and I hope you are going on satisfactorily to yourself. It was all your father's doing. He set his heart on it, and he ought to know. So again, she's this absent woman who just relies on what Mr. Gradgrind thinks. He ought to know. She trusts in her husband, even at this point where she's, you know, about to die. And a couple of lines from the bottom. I think there's a pain somewhere in the room, said Mrs. Gradgrind, but I couldn't positively say that I've got it. Now, we've had Louisa and Tom being very distant from their own bodies. Louisa looking into the fire, Tom being like this robot. And here Mrs. Gradgrind can't even identify her own pain. You know, she's so distant from herself. And Dickens is making the point that these people are absent almost even from their own bodies. They're so distant from emotion and from normality that that they can't even, you know, equate that with their own sort of sense of self. And then on 186, we see the role of Sissy coming in. So again, this very different kind of woman in the text. So about 5 lines down, Louisa's sister's brought in. So she was brought and stood with her hand in her sister's. Louisa had observed her with her arm around Sissy's neck, and she felt the difference of this approach. She didn't notice the difference, she felt the difference of this approach. So we get that word feel and felt, which is significant. It shows us what's been missing in Louisa. And there's that idea that Dickens is suggesting that the difference in the sister who's had Sissy with her is one of feeling. It's not one that's discernible in any way other than through emotion. It's what's missing in Tom and Louisa. We're told halfway down the page about Sissy's face. There's something of the gentleness of the other face in the room. The sweet face with the trusting eyes, made paler than watching and sympathy made it by the rich dark hair. So whereas Bixer is pale and sort of washed out, Sissy is pale, but it's in contrast to this rich dark hair. And again, it's all about feeling, isn't it? The face is so pale because of the sympathy that Sissy feels. So again, even in her appearance, it's all about feeling. About 2/3 of the way down, Mrs. Gradgrind sort of starts to get this slight self-awareness, I guess, as she's close to death. She says, "You must remember, my dear, that whenever I've said anything on any subject, I have never heard the last of it, and consequently, that I have long left off saying anything." Tiny little line there, but really, really pertinent. It shows Mrs. Gradgrind's role, doesn't it? You know, this silenced woman who just doesn't speak because this system, this patriarchal system, just doesn't let her get a word in. Very, very bottom of the page, Louisa replies, she says, "I can hear you, mother, when you have strength to go on." This to keep her from floating away. We've had the rose petals floating away, Thomas biting the rose head, and those petals floating away to represent his lost childhood. Here, Mrs. Gradgrind floating away. It's the same description. Again, utilitarianism has done for her, hasn't it? So we get these links, you know, the wife in this system and Louisa and Tom equally are floating away, and there's a sense of loss and waste in terms of what's happened. And then in the final paragraph of the chapter, when she actually does die, the narrator chips in. He says, it matters little what figures of wonderful no meaning she began to trace upon her wrappers. So she dies just sort of tracing these symbols. And the point about these symbols is that they don't actually mean anything. And that's Dickens's point. It's that rebellion against utilitarianism. I mean, just you know, going crazy, just drawing anything that just doesn't fit with this system. The hand soon stopped in the midst of them. The light that had always been feeble and dim behind the weak transparency went out. And even Mrs. Gradgrind emerged from the shadow in which man walketh and disquieteth himself in vain, took upon her the dread solemnity of the sages and patriarchs. So at this moment when she dies, she's mid-writing these things, and we get that sense of rebellion. It's only in a death that she really sort of comes forward. And then Mrs. Sparsit's staircase. Odd chapter title, it's a metaphor basically. Mrs. Sparsit imagines that there's a staircase that Louisa's walking down. She's really relishing the fact that Louisa's going to disgrace herself. She thinks Louisa's going to either start an affair with James Harthouse or leave her husband. And Mrs. Sparsit's really revelling in this and imagines Louisa going down a staircase, descending. Remember, the next two chapters are called Lower and Lower and Down, so Dickens is really playing on this idea that Louisa's going to descend. Obviously, it turns out that the down is referring to her falling at her father's feet, not being disgraced. So we're told about 5 lines from the bottom of page 188. She erected in her mind a mighty staircase with a dark pit of shame and ruin at the bottom, and down those stairs from day to day and hour to hour she saw Louisa coming. So that idea that Dickens actually, you know, makes physical this descent of Louisa, this idea of disgrace that's sort of coming to her, this fall from innocence, I guess. So very much like Atonement, you know, that Bryony sort of sins and drops down to innocence. Remember, Atonement ends with Bryony going down some stairs as well to the tube station. So it's a very, very similar image. But Dickens, in contrast to sort of McEwan, is showing the character actually who's already lost her innocence. Louisa can't descend because she's lost her childhood. She didn't have the innocence in the first place. She didn't have a childhood. So that's a really nice contrast to sort of draw out. And then towards the bottom of page 189, Mr. Bounderby cuts in and speaks to Mrs. Sparsit. In the meantime, Ma'am, I have an opinion, if you ask me my opinion, that the less she is talked about, the better. They're talking about the old woman there who ends up being Bounderby's mum, and there's the idea she's saying, just you know, erase her. So we've just had Mrs. Gradgrind drawing these shapes, no meaning, and then Bounderby scrubbing a woman out of the story. And again, it's that patriarchal view of just destroying this mother role. You know, both times it's a mother. And then about 7 or 8 lines down on page 190, Mrs. Sparsit's described, she's got a hawk's eye, she's watching Louisa in the Harthouse. We told Mrs. Sparsit was too distant to hear a word of their discourse or even to know that they were speaking softly, otherwise than from the expression of their figures, but what they said was this. So Dickens playing around with that narrator again. Mrs. Sparsit is standing at the window, can't quite hear what they're saying, can't quite see what's happening, exactly the same as Bryony in Atonement, looking out the nursery window. She thinks she knows what's going on, but actually she's not aware. And whereas McEwan gives us then the point of view from Cecilia and Robbie to fill in the blanks, Dickens uses the omniscient narrator. We get what they said was this. Dickens going in with that narrator to give us that full picture. And then basically Harthouse convinces Louisa that it must have been Stephen Blackpool who robbed from the bank. As a way of sort of manipulating her. Remember, he's just desperate to sort of get around her. And when he tells her that about 7 or 8 lines down on page 191, she says, I almost feel as though it must be bad in me, returned Louisa, after sitting thoughtful a while, to be so ready to agree with you and to be so lightened in my heart by what you say. She's lightened because it means that it's not Tom's fault. If it was Stephen Blackpool, it couldn't be Tom. But again, just like with Tom, we get this sense of Harthouse almost being like this devil. It must be bad in me. You know, he's bringing out almost the bad in other people, using Tom as his weapon to sort of get around Louisa. And then the next sort of line is his response. He says, I only say what is reasonable, nothing worse. I've talked over with my friend Tom more than once. Of course, I remain on terms of perfect confidence with Tom, and he's quite of my opinion, and I am of his. Will you walk? So Harthouse saying, you know, we've talked, and it must have been this Stephen Blackpool. We get the line, I only say what is reasonable, nothing worse. Compare that to Sissy. Sissy's total trust in her dad. Everybody knows the dad's not coming back, he's run off and he's left her, but Sissy won't accept it. Here, Harthouse saying, oh, I'm just saying what's reasonable. So again, Dickens is putting those two things side by side. Harthouse saying, oh, it's just reason, it's just fact. And Sissy saying, whatever the fact, I've got trust in my dad. So again, the focus is on feeling. It's not about facts, it's about what you feel. And we've found out in the last chapter that the difference between Louisa and the younger sister isn't one of fact, isn't one of concrete sort of upbringing, isn't one of appearance, it's one of feeling, that the younger sister's got feelings through Sissy. And here we see that they're absent in Louisa, they're absent in Harthouse, because they're in this very sort of hollow world where there's nothing sort of going on. But Sissy has injected that feeling into everybody else. And possibly with some of that, these women are going to be a little bit stronger and they're going to avoid the trap that Mrs. Gregor falls into. And that sort of sets up then the last two chapters of this book, which are lower and lower and down. So as we think that Louisa's going to disgrace herself, but actually she falls down at her father's feet as he sees utilitarianism just totally crumble.